Hi all, it's Grace. Just before we get into this episode, two things. The first is that Nick really wants to emphasize that architecture is really a solo endeavor and that there have been a few key collaborators that he would like to acknowledge. These people are Henry Stevens, Jack Davies, Jay Sy, Julia Gottstein, Jimmy and Elspeth Gray and the Roberts Gray team, and Nicola Bradshaw, who has been a constant support through it all. And the second is, unfortunately, I don't know what I did. I did something to the video, so if you are wanting to watch this on YouTube, unlike usual, there will be no video aspect, just the audio. So sorry about that. We're all learning here. Thank you so much. Enjoy the episode.
My big suggestion to students, particularly through high school, is
you can do anything.
Choose it for you, not for it is worth
Just focus on the next step.
Doesn't matter what you're doing.
Don't be afraid.
As long as you're doing something.
That is such good advice.
I don't think I could see myself doing anything else.
Challenging life.
Student nights, Wednesday to Saturday.
I worked on that house.
I racked up every single dollar of debt that I
I
possibly
think
could.
there's a lot of pressure on high school.
Yeah, I
kids
just
these
love
days, right?
working outside.
And if money is something that you care a lot
In
about.
hindsight, that
I've
was
also been a very indecisive
That you
person.
keep looking for roads that have been less
It
travelled.
was just that moment that I knew what I wanted to do. So nothing else is going to change that.
Welcome to the guest speaker.
Really stoked to have you here, Nick. My pitch for you is really finding guests that will stretch the aspiration of New Zealand students and provide incredible insight into careers is not always easy. We genuinely believe all students should have the opportunity to hear from leaders in their field. And today we welcome Nick Roberts, an architect of the highest regard and someone that will definitely stretch the aspiration of students and provide an insight into architecture that is second to none. Nick is an internationally recognised architect, educator and author whose work is defined by a rare combination of design excellence, intellectual rigour and global perspective. With a career spanning New Zealand, Australia, the United States and the Netherlands, he has built a reputation for delivering architecture of exceptional quality across diverse cultural and environmental contexts. As the founding director of Roberts Gray Architects, established in 2021, alongside Jimmy Gray and Elspeth Gray, you lead a practice grounded in collective expertise and deeply collaborative in the design process. The studio reflects the breadth of its directors' international experience, with all principals actively engaged across every stage of each project, ensuring both conceptual strength and technical precision. Prior to founding this practice, you played a pivotal role at John Wardle Architects, where you led the design of several high-profile projects that received Australian Institute of Architects National Awards. Your professional standing was further affirmed by being selected for the prestigious AIA Dulux Study Tour in 2022, an honour awarded to emerging leaders in the field. Your portfolio also includes the winning international competition for the new Australian Prime Minister's residence and exhibiting work at the Venice Architecture Biennale. Roberts Gray Architects has already secured national recognition for its debut built project, the Wanaka SKI House, which won both the 2024 New Zealand Institute of Architects National and Southern Awards. Roberts Gray's latest project, the Double Courtyard House, which pending review is earning award shortlistings and publication in leading design publications. Beyond practice, you've made significant contributions to the architectural profession, having taught at advanced design studios including Harvard University, the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts, and the University of Melbourne. Written work including a monograph for the UN Studio and contributions to London-based Real Review, further reinforcing your role as both a practitioner and a thought leader in the profession. For students inspired by careers like Nick's, this podcast offers a window into the pathways into architecture, highlighting where study can begin and how aspirations can take shape. In New Zealand, leading institutions such as the University of Auckland, Victoria University of Wellington, Auckland University of Technology and Unitec offer undergraduate programs in architecture or related fields, typically followed by a Master of Architecture professional as a first step in the pathway to meet registration requirements. Whether driven by creativity, problem solving, or a passion for the built environment, this conversation is designed to help emerging designers understand the journey from study to practice and what it takes to succeed at an international level. And as I read those accolades, I saw Grace sitting there grinning. when I reached out to my brother-in-law, James Roberts, and said, I'm after an architect, and he said, oh, I've got a nephew who's okay. I think he exceeded all expectations because I was stoked when I read your resume. So to have kids hear from you today is an absolute pleasure. Welcome to the guest speaker, Nick. Can I take you back to school? Because a lot of people who will listen to this will be sitting there and maybe year 11 or even year 10 thinking they want to be an architect, maybe wanting to hear how you found school, what subjects resonated with you, and get some insights there to start with.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that and for the introduction. To go back to secondary school, I was at St. Pat's Silverstream, and it was a great school, and I enjoyed my time there. But it wasn't necessarily a school that I was exposed to maybe the creative fields that would be an obvious feeder into architecture. But what it did give me was quite a broad range of experiences and I guess rigor in the learning. A lot of people directed towards, I guess, sport was heavily emphasized and subjects related to financial literacy and law and things like that. And so architecture wasn't particularly on my radar through high school at all. It was sort of a background feeling from having unusual or exceptional buildings maybe pointed out to me by my parents, but it wasn't front of mind by any stretch.
So subject wise, then were you just was it, can you remember into year 13? Were you doing bio, chem? Were you doing
Oh, sure, yeah. I was doing I think if I think of subjects that resonated and carried through in some way, I was doing calculus and physics, but probably more impactful would have been English. I did graphics, but it was sort of in a way treated as a minor subject, but it did give a sense of how to draft and draw. But no real creative subjects other than I think English. But some of that was indeed relevant. I think the maths and the sciences through to some of the creative and critical thinking that you develop in English really reflects some of the sort of broad church that architecture is and the broad skill base between the sort of art and science and English sort of thinking that you need. You need to be engaged in architecture, interested and drawn towards a great number of subjects. So it's almost like an anti-specialization, specialized degree, if that makes sense.
Just in terms of academic performance, because some kids do dwell on this, maybe too much, but sort of where were you sitting? And because normally there'd be some measure of, am I good enough? If I was going medicine, someone might say, well, you're going to need these sorts of marks or you might not cope. Did you get a sense of that, or were you a high performer, or did it not matter?
I was kind of wildly inconsistent in some ways, like through through many years, through the early years up until about sixth form, I did well and got good grades, and then I think with the impending shift toward university and a lack of clarity about where I was going, I think my motivation dropped toward the final year, year 13, and I think that my grades were fine, but not exceptional at that point. And I guess what that's probably taught me in retrospect is that when I'm motivated, I can really focus on something for endless hours at a time. But if I can't sort of grasp the direction or the purpose, then it's a harder task. So it's not. I'd say it's not about this kind of continual upward ascent. There's lots of soul searching and inconsistency along the way. And I think toward the end of high school, I was kind of a bit more tapped out, whereas in the previous years, I was a bit much more engaged.
No, and I think that'd be a comment I'd say if someone made me generalize about kids at school, it would be that tapping out by year 13, that's for sure. That lack of clarity you talked about, at what point you were sitting in year 13, how did you decide to go to architecture? We've interviewed someone who actually became a nutritionist. They applied for architecture school and didn't get in, and that was their turning point. So obviously there was a bit of, to get in, you had to do something special. It's not like just me with my BA at Vic. I just wandered off there. When did your decision come? How did that, I mean, obviously someone had pointed it out, and then that application process.
I had gone to a number of open day subject reviews at Victoria University and had that in the back of my mind, but didn't really have a clear sense of why I was drawn towards that. I do understand that some of the Auckland universities require a portfolio for entry. I don't know if that's still the case, but in the case of Victoria, it's competitive entry for second year. So first year can be a huge volume of students, and they might go into any number of creative subjects, and it's a much broader introduction to architecture. And then from there, there's a smaller number that get through and are selected to go through that second year. And so in my case, if I was required to have that portfolio up front, I wouldn't have got in, I don't think, and because I didn't have one, I didn't have really any traditionally creative subjects to draw upon. You did need to have a base level of calculus and physics at the time to get through, but there was not really any other, apart from university entrance and having passed those subjects. I don't think there was anything beyond that. And so first year for me was overwhelming in that sense, because it was academically, that is, because it was a very I was going from having no real emphasis on creative thinking into it kind of being the main thing, and being sort of cast adrift, trying to learn how to shift gears in my brain to respond to this sort of new, both the newness of university, but also this kind of new way of learning. It wasn't like in any way a continuation from high school. It was quite disorienting in some ways.
It is interesting you say, because I'd need to do some research. If kids are sitting there and maybe they've already, their dad, mum's an architect, and they sort of know some fundamentals, Auckland might be quite a nice option of presenting a portfolio. Clearly, though, Vic, for people like yourself, if you haven't really started that journey, is a good option, because, like I say, this young girl definitely missed out through the portfolio. During that first year, how did you cope? You're saying you struggled a little bit. I think I struggled first year at university too. I think it is a whole new world. Were you still at home? Were you staying at calls? Was there any something like that you had to deal with? And then how did you deal with trying to get into the second year?
I think I was living at home the first year, and I went flatting in the second year. There was still, I guess, a lack of clarity, but just pushing through with the projects and the subjects, and feeling like there was something in this, or perhaps not having a clear alternative, or a sense that I could bail out of it, because I guess the thing that was intriguing to me was the complete gear shift in my way of thinking. In that, when you notice yourself learning in a completely different register like that, it's while it might be hard and you might not be doing well, it's sort of telling you something about the growth, or maybe there's something in this.
Is there anything, because you're really doing a great job of saying the difficulty in the new way of thinking, is there anything you feel, say you had a young son or daughter, and they were 15 going, I might go to architecture school, was there something you would do to stay, well, right, we're going to start something here, you're going to start to do these things? Is there anything, or is it always going to be confusing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes high school can be a little insular, and the criteria for success quite narrow. And not every school is necessarily like that, and it's often that narrowness is often just something you perceive because you're young and you're green. But what I would say is architecture is something that requires you to be really engaged and observant of the world. You're both sort of an observer and a participant, and so I think if I mean, now that I'm a father, I've two daughters, I'm sort of consciously thinking about it because I'm trying to expose them to as much as I possibly can. So, if that's engaging with, sports teams or going to art galleries regularly, reading widely, you take on that responsibility of exposing your child to the world in the fullest way and the most rounded way, possible. Because ultimately, if you're designing buildings for people and for cities, you need to understand, and for environments, you need to understand all of those things, and it requires you to be a real deep all-rounder. And it requires you to be interested in other people and very empathetic in that sense. So being a bit more intentional with that kind of breadth would be something I would really focus on.
Yeah, I had an epiphany once. I can't remember who it was. We were in a city and they said, look up. And for the,
Yeah.
when you walk through a city, your head's down, and they said, look up. And it's always been something that's resonated with me for some reason, just to look, and then suddenly there's a clock on the top of a building, or the difference in height and the wind, and it's a whole new world. It's like going underneath the world and going diving. Can you piece together, you get in second year, from then on, what do you learn? What can someone expect about the way they study, the material you cover, and how that is assessed to one day become who you've become? What did they teach you, and what was that learning like?
Yeah, sure. It's kind of a spectrum from practical to creative subjects, as I kind of suggested. There's classes focused on construction technology and structures, so how a building performs and how a building stands up. But the main emphasis, I think, was at the time the design studios and the history and theory studios. So each design studio would set a project brief, and that would be based on the agenda or the interests of the professor leading it. And each design studio could be on a completely different topic. You might be designing a fashion store or a waterfront park or a bridge or whatever, but you'd develop a semester of research around that and develop a design proposition. That may tie into other subjects as a way of assessing the practical aspects of your design. So um, you may be presenting your design through or working your design through the structures or the construction course as well. And then at the end of, or intermittently throughout semester, and then at the end, there's a design crit or critique that happens, which is something quite unique to architectural culture, especially at university, where you get up in front of your class or a sort of a public audience and present and even sort of defend your work. And that was a very nerve-wracking thing for many students, because you have to explain yourself, you have to speak clearly, you have to defend your ideas, and depending on who's reviewing your work, it can be both a sort of a nice conversation and an exploratory conversation, or it can be quite confrontational depending on who you get on the day. And I don't, again, that culture of critique varies from school to school, and I think it's probably softened somewhat over the years, but I do think it's an essential part of it, because, in the world beyond university, you're frequently having to present your work to clients, having to get them to agree or to be on board with the ideas in your project. I mean, architecture is a very contingent art form. It's not like you're a painter painting a painting or a sculptor sculpting a sculpture where you're working on the final product. Your architecture is very dependent on other people wanting to pay for it, wanting to live in it, wanting to experience it. It's not built by you. You're effectively creating a set of instructions for someone else to realize it. So in order for you to work through that, you need to be comfortable with it translating from the page to a built reality.
You have to present it to clients, but I wonder too, are there times when, like, we've had a builder on and he probably sits on the other end where sometimes they might get an architect's design and go like, we can't do this, or we can, or maybe it's difficult. I don't know, like how much, and it depends, I guess, significantly on what you're actually working on, but do you ever consult with other, I don't know if vendors is the right word, but other people that, to your point, will actually execute on the build?
Yeah, absolutely. And it really emphasizes the importance of good relationships with all the people that come together to realize something special like that. So, in the case of a builder, in many cases, you might have like they might have early involvement with the design, and you might be if they're like the preferred builder, maybe the client has a relationship with them, and they'll become very familiar with the project and might buy into the principles of what it is, and also guide the practicality about how some parts of it might be executed. More traditionally, you might have a tender, which means you're sending the drawings out to a bunch of builders to try to get the best price or the best construction methodology or the best quality, depending on what your priorities are. And then once that builder's engaged, you really want to be in a really good, open kind of conversational dialogue with them throughout the entire process, because it makes the project so much richer, and the more people you have invested in the outcome, the better.
When you mentioned the built reality you mentioned earlier, is the ultimate aim of the university degree, is it prior to masters to leave knowing you have the skill set to design something? That's the reality of it. And you said there were bridges, there could be homes, there could be whatever so that's essentially you get your degree that qualifies you. You should understand how to do that. You're going to be able to build, or not build, you're going to be able to design those things. Then what does the masters add on top of that? Or is that what masters does?
Well, I'd say unfortunately, university doesn't prepare you to be a competent architect. It's it's quite a long road to
Same as teaching.
Yeah, yeah. It probably develops um, a way of thinking and approaching problems so that you can design and you can think critically, and you might have some base level understanding of how a building goes together. But ultimately, you're coming out of university being someone who is thinking about the issues of the day, is able to think about whatever those issues are and respond to them with a design. But you're a long way off, I think, being able to build, unless you've had some kind of parallel experience with construction or drafting. I don't think you're probably there yet. So you're getting a lot of that through practice, and there's a lot of I think expectation on practices to provide a lot of that training, and it's also why after your masters you become a registered architect. Anywhere between sort of 3 to 10 years after graduating, depending on the experience that you get in your professional life. To your other question about the bachelor-master distinction, it's really the bachelor's sort of a broad education of the base level skills from the practical to the artistic, say, and a series of design studios. Masters is really where you might sharpen your focus toward particular interests and develop a thesis and refine your way of thinking, so that you're coming out of university with a particular position or an agenda or an approach toward architecture. And again, this isn't determining your entire career, but it's just effectively allowing you to leave university as a more critical thinker, I would say, is the fundamental aim.
So just let me get this right. I've got a scenario for you. I buy a section and I want a house designed. That person who's going to design that house is going to have to have worked with someone like you prior. Because what I'd find is, or you might find it, if you have a young person working for you, are they an apprentice? I'm not sure. Or are they just a young architect? But you might find they'll do a design and you'll come to them and go, look, yeah, you don't even know we're north facing. You do realize this is a coastal environment. You know that the materials you've tried to use, is that sort of like you could literally be not useless, but really you've got talent that could come, but there's a lot of mistakes that have not been taught that I'd be an idiot, one, to employ that young architect. They're going to learn that from you. Equally the same with a young teacher. They arrive, they really don't, they know the history of education. They have no idea of presence in a room. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I'd just say that architect's a protected term. So you can only call yourself that once you've gone through the registration process. So anyone on that pathway would be an architectural graduate. And ideally, if you're engaging with them, you can't have getting into the nitty gritty here, but your building consent drawings signed off by anyone who's not like either a licensed building practitioner or a registered architect. You might be able to get a sort of a concept done by someone who's in training, but ultimately that needs to be taken through into a professional practice in order to be reviewed, drawn up to a level that a builder could use, and obtaining the consents that you would need to build your house.
Okay. So when did you get a sense? Because there's one thing to be called an architect. When did you have the confidence to call yourself good? If you listen to my introduction, you've become good, let's face it. But when did that happen? When did you wake up one day and go, actually, now I get it? I think back on my teaching career and I say, the poor kids in my first 5 years, I feel like sending an apology letter. I just didn't understand what I was doing. When were you good?
I don't think in those terms. Architecture gives you a lot of constant reasons to be modest or humble, because there's so many levels at which a building can fail. And what I'd say is it's felt like there's just been a continual series of little milestones that made me feel like I was making progress. It took me until probably my third year of university before something. I initially just was, I think, again, aimlessly drifting from paper to paper until I was exposed to the right teacher and the right set of ideas and projects that made me realize that architecture was about so much more than that. I think another little milestone in the journey was starting working for Ian Athfield in Wellington, who was a very inspirational person and figure. And then for many years I had a partnership with a close friend of mine, Henry Stevens, and we sort of did projects after hours, just speculative, made up projects and competitions. And they started to get traction, the Australian Prime Minister's House competition, which we won, and the work in Venice. And these are little milestones that make you feel like there's traction and you're developing a way of thinking that might be enduring or set you up. But I think it's really hard to be that confident when each new project throws up so many different challenges and you're exposed to so many different types of cultures and people. So I'm confident in the sense that each step has made me love the profession more, but each new challenge has really reinforced how engaged you need to remain in order to keep making that progress as you shift from project to project and opportunity to opportunity.
Yeah. There's some words you use there, enduring, and they throw things up in culture and people. For maybe the year 10, 11 kid who's just maybe sitting here now listening to this going, I might want to become an architect. What aspects, just as a general feel, do you cover? I mean, I threw some random silly things like, I'm facing north or I'm coastal. In a housing development, if someone comes and they've got money, they come to you and they go, right, I want something special. What are some of the aspects you're covering that might really lighten up kids' eyes so that going from start to finish to make something special?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I could speak about a house that we've designed recently that might give some context for this. So a house that we recently finished is called the Double Courtyard House, and it sits on the edge of a very exposed coastline north of Auckland at a place called Te Arai. And the client's grief was very simple. He said, I just want a house to be barefoot in. and that implies a sort of a sense of openness and connection to the environment. And at the same time, that environment is very harsh and highly variable. And so you can't have a house that's constantly open and exposed to that, or else it would sort of fall into ruin quite quickly. And so from starting to understand the client's desire, you start to imagine how a building might respond to that, or create a concrete representation of what they're imagining. And so in this instance, the creation of these two courtyards in the house provided a constant sense to an external landscape while being sheltered from this really harsh and variable coastal environment. And so from that initial interpretation of the brief, we started to create something that they didn't necessarily imagine themselves, but through the creative process is what we arrived at.
Wicked. The barefoots is just such a cool concept, isn't it? Like I would have expected to sit with someone like you if I had some money and go, right, and talk colors and materials, but it can be something that once you have a feeling or a sense of a person or a concept like barefoot, off you go.
Yeah, I mean, architecture, especially in housing, can be so aspirational, and we're all inundated with images and ideas of what's trendy or what's fashionable. But ultimately, you need to set that aside and get to know the people that you're working for and the environment that you're building within, and start to develop a design that'll emerge from those kind of factors rather than a premeditated idea about what you want. It requires a sort of openness and curiosity to the world that is, I think, a critical part of the creative process. And I liked your comment earlier about how someone told you to look up, and you start noticing things. And I think that's a massive thing for I think a young student to consider, is that what is usually the background to your life is suddenly the foreground. So if you can imagine, you spend your entire life moving through cities and buildings, they're governing the way that you interact with people, with your family, with friends, how you experience environments. It's all kind of designed and therefore the background, and you're usually not thinking about it. And architectural training allows you to shift those kinds of things that are orchestrating your life into the foreground.
Is that why, Nick, like, I'm curious about the stuff you've done overseas, because obviously New Zealand versus the Netherlands, no one, maybe they are, but in the Netherlands, they're not asking to be barefoot because their houses are on leans and they're dealing with practicalities. Like, at what point, I guess, and I might be jumping a bit, you're in New Zealand, you're doing some stuff in Australia. How do you go overseas? Is it project based? Like, what does that look like?
Overseas for me has happened in a number of different countries in a number of different ways. The first was an opportunity to do a student exchange to UC Berkeley in California, which is just outside of San Francisco. Beyond that, the next journey was to the Netherlands, and then back to the States a little bit during that time through Harvard, and then Melbourne after that. So, do you want me to speak to the different experiences of these places, or
Yes,
was there a
please.
particular aspect?
I think you speak to it, and what, like you say, you went to the Netherlands. I'm particularly interested because I was there last year. So
Okay.
I want to know, and like students might be thinking, oh, cool, you can travel. What does that look like? So yeah, what caused you to go there, and how did you find it to each place, please?
Yeah, sure. At the time, there are a number of, well, what I guess what an interesting contradiction in architecture is that it's very local, and that to build anything or to realize anything, you need to understand how a local culture and climate and context works, and you need to be usually registered in that country in order to realize the ability. But at the same time, it's a very global discipline. It travels really well. You can insert yourself, and again, that's that idea of the kind of curiosity and engagement with the world around you. It allows you a way of um, traveling and seeing these sort of cities and landscapes that you're visiting through a different lens. The Netherlands was particularly interesting. one of my brothers was living there, and there are a number of Dutch architecture practices that were both local and global. They had started working across the Netherlands, but had managed to extend their design approach to a global audience. So the particular practice I worked for, which was UN Studio, was Amsterdam based, but worked all over the world. And so the appeal of living in this incredible city, which I think remains to me one of the most impressive and unique cities in the world. Pairing that with this feeling of kind of constantly being foreign, and that each new project would be a different type of building in a different country, was this really interesting mix for me. Amsterdam itself was incredibly unique, and as I said, and the reasons for that was that it's quite a small city. I think it sits around 1 million people or just under that, but it sort of has it has the cultural capital or weight of a Paris or London, and then as a city to live in, it's very walkable, bikeable. Everything's 5 minutes from where you need it to be. It's very diverse, and it's both in culture but also scale of business. So you might have, Nike's European headquarters based there. At the same time, it's very hospitable to startups and small business. And so you have this kind of perfect mix of things all working together in a relatively small footprint, which was, I'm not going to pretend I knew all of this at the outset, but it was something that I discovered and loved once I got into it.
The Harvard and the Melbourne and those sort of opportunities, where did they come from? If that's something people are interested in, maybe kids who are studying architecture at the moment.
Yeah. In parallel to working in an architecture practice, I'd always been interested in teaching. One of the reasons for that is, as an architect, you're often receiving the brief from a client. For something to exist, they have to have the money and the desire to do a particular thing, and come to you, and you react to that. Whereas in teaching, you can pursue and develop your own interests and develop your own position that will then make those projects richer when they do come to you, or help direct them. Or people might come to you because you think a certain way, rather than just being a neutral architecture practice that takes anything on. So the teaching thing was always an interest. And then parallel to moving to the Netherlands, I'd applied to study at Harvard and was accepted to study there. And I was in a tricky position of either taking a job in the Netherlands or going to Harvard. The Harvard thing required scholarships and all sorts of things to make it work financially, which I didn't get, and I wasn't prepared or able really to take the financial hit of doing that. And so once I was in the Netherlands, the opportunity to teach at Harvard was quite a nice way to engage with the university while without going through the degree process. The way that happened was that the practice I worked for was of some kind of global renown, and they often invite well-known practices to come and run design studios at the university. And so the founder of the company asked me to develop and run the course with him in collaboration, and that was the kind of unexpected entry point into teaching there. What I would say about the exposure to the American system as opposed to the New Zealand educational system, which came about through the exchange program at Berkeley, and then managing to teach at Harvard, was that the students were typically much older in the master's program. They had done their undergrad, and I don't know if you're experiencing or observing this, Grace, but usually taken anywhere between 1 or 3, even more years off in the workforce, and then come back to do their masters. And so you had people who are developing their thesis or their master's projects with a bit more time in the world. Whereas in Wellington, I found people were kind of just more or less keen to run straight through from bachelor to master and get it over and done with. And so it was much more connected to that idea of, say, lifelong learning and a different attitude. The students at Harvard who we were teaching a master's level studio, but I'd say 50% of the students in our class had been studying other things. So they might have been doing economics or philosophy or any number of things, and then they're jumping into architecture at a master's level. So you had people from both, diverse in their background, but diverse in their education, which meant that not everyone was starting from the same position, and it made for, really interesting discussions and also experiences as a teacher.
I'm going to push for this one, Nick, and I know you don't want to answer it, but I'm going to go back to my good question. I mean, you're at Harvard, you've been accepted. Even if you don't, you can talk about it being someone else. What do you see and do? Because there's a kid sitting now either prior to uni or in uni just wanting to go, is there something I can do that there is some system to it? Because clearly you're good. There's no magic bullet I get. And what I think is, in my mind at the moment, there's some methodical stuff you do. There's baseline before I start, I need these things ticked off before the creative stuff can go. But are there any insights? Why are you recognized? Why are you at Harvard? Why do you win some awards? Is it hard work? Is it your attention to detail? What is it?
If there's one thing, I would say it's not just passively receiving the work from my boss or the task from my teacher. It was always actively doing something more, something on the side, pursuing independent projects and independent thought. Because as I say, architecture can be perceived as a service profession where you are in service of the public or the client or whoever, which you absolutely are. But if you don't, in parallel, develop your own independent, unique voice or perspective, then it will only ever be that. And so I guess the one thing I did was I always did projects writing designs in parallel, and they had no they had no financial incentive or drive at the time, but they massively shaped who I am and how I think about it today, and opened up opportunities that I couldn't have foreseen at the outset.
Perfect. Yeah. Can you, because I'm just loving when you're talking architecture. My thing is materials. Can you talk to me about materials? For example, I took Grace as a student. We went over to Craggy Range. The guy who owns Craggy Range in Australia, and he made his millions in concrete. So a lot of it's concrete based. And I mentioned maybe coastal where I live, the mountains in Otago. And how do you think about materials? What materials do you love working with or building with? Or
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's sort of one of the fundamental entry points into understanding how a culture it does things. You'll notice, when you might be traveling Europe or the States, there's a material that's probably been extracted from somewhere pretty close by, and it's informed why a lot of the things look the way they do. So at a baseline, you're trying to tap into the history of that place and to find out what has been, you're not always necessarily reinventing the wheel every time. You're trying to look at what is appropriate rather than necessarily inventive. And then once you have that base level understanding, you can take it from there. But as a general attitude and approach, I would say I have a real interest in natural materials. The double courtyard houses made from rammed earth is designed to be resilient in that kind of harsh environment. You're understanding that steel will rust out, and so you're being careful about what's exposed to those sorts of environments. We've built in the South Island of New Zealand and with a heavier kind of masonry construction, and the far north you might be using a more lightweight timber approach. The key thing about the natural materials is that they tend to wear in rather than wear out. So, cheap, highly processed materials will need to be turned over and replaced and tend to be more environmentally irresponsible. But if you get something that looks better as it gets older, you're probably onto a winner there.
Fascinating. Give me one, the person, whoever it was, who told me to look up once, and you mentioned it just before, when you said when you travel, and Grace and I both love traveling. Is there something else other than look up? Like, if you go through the islands and you're starting to get me to feel that idea of history and appropriateness to place. Are there other little insights like look up you would encourage us to do? Not as budding architects, because I'm not one, but there will be some.
Yeah. I think when you look at a building and it might catch your eye for whatever reason, it's sort of an expression of the values. What a society valued at the time. Why did they spend 600 years building a church? That's an insane thing to do today, but and the economic conditions would never permit that. But there is a certain history of how humans lived and what they valued that might explain why a building is the way it is. Probably one of the most vivid travel experiences I had in relation to a building was visiting the National Assembly or the Parliament buildings in Bangladesh. They were designed by a well-known American architect called Louis Kahn, and the buildings are architecturally significant and interesting in their own right, but possibly more interesting is the fact that the building exists at all. There was a civil war between East and West Pakistan that led to the birth of Bangladesh, and throughout all of this kind of turmoil and intense period of history, this building kind of persisted, and the fact that it was built in spite of all of this instability is kind of a remarkable part of the story, and that it bears the scars from this very traumatic backstory. And so I think architecture is a really good entry point into finding out more about the world on those terms.
It ties into your curiosity element. You're curious when you build, but it inspires people to be curious afterwards. So it's quite a cool thread.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it makes architecture more accessible to everyone if they understand that everyone has a stake in it, and that you don't need the training to appreciate it or be engaged with it. You don't need to know all the jargon or the technical reasons about why the facade of that building is constructed that way. There's lots of different entry points depending on whether you're a lay person or trained in it.
What's the future for you, Nick? Because you've come a long way, and I'm going to say a relatively short time, sort of teaching, creating stuff, winning stuff. Got a business now, so you're a businessman as well as an architect. Where do you see yourself going?
Well, the most recent change, which might set up where I see it going, is that we were from the Netherlands. We moved to Melbourne, and that's where you mentioned I'd worked for John Wardle Architects, which was again another really formative experience. And then the impetus for moving home and to Auckland was to start the practice. At the same time, in parallel, had started a family. We'd had our firstborn in Melbourne and our second since in Auckland. So two girls, 5 and 2. And I think, I think what it's really done is sort of light a fire under me to make sure that it all works and it all stacks up, because there's an added sense of responsibility when you shift from, just developing your own career versus the mindset you have where you're trying to also make sure that you're giving your family or contributing to your family life in the best possible way. And so the practice has been running since 21. We've got a couple of build projects under our belt. The practice has grown to 7 people, and we're starting, despite, as you can appreciate, really challenging economic times, getting some traction, and we're developing buildings and our architecture in a way that is true to our values and what we want, and we hope that there's a feedback loop where people out there see the work and it resonates with them, and that brings people to us that are attracted to that way of thinking. So I'm really excited for the practice to kind of grow up a little bit. It's a 5-year-old at the moment, and for it to mature, to learn to work on the business as much as the buildings, if that makes sense. Like architecture's an interesting business in that it's very much tied to the identity of its makers. You know, you go to us because you want us to be working on it, not because we're palming it off to someone else to design. And so there will always be this connection to the work we produce, but at the same time, learning to make sure that the practice culture, its finances, its operations is running just as smoothly as the buildings. So I think, yeah, continually learning that balance will be a big goal, and that hopefully those things tie into doing the best possible work that we can.
And you tell me, even if it's a bit of a pitch to myself, why does someone come to an architect? Because the myth would be it's really, really expensive. So there's an
Yeah.
investment right from the start. But then that investment, it's starting to dawn on me, it's either invest in that or have the lifelong disappointment of wondering why there were no windows on that side, or why the hell the basement didn't have a door next to it, or, like I'd imagine there's a million disappointments in many homes that there is no architect involved. They're just, is it really expensive? And
Yeah. Well, what I'd say is we work across a number of budgets, and what you are getting value in is that consciousness around what your budget is and how best to use the money available to get the best possible outcome. And so you'll see architects working across all number of sectors, because there's a belief that architecture should be both, this really refined, highly considered thing, but also accessible to the most amount of people. So, to give you an example, one of our most celebrated practices, Stevens Lawson, have designed, yes, many high-end houses, but they've also designed Homeground, which is the city mission in Auckland, for people who are most in need. Other practices, Monk Mackenzie, for example, are another practice who are Auckland-based. Again, they've designed many high-end houses, but they also design it for the Kāinga Ora. So they're providing social housing as well. And so architecture exists across a spectrum. Good architects are really engaged in society, and it's not seen as a luxury product only. Yes, there's absolutely part of it that exists in that world, and that probably gets a lot of airtime, but to sort of the general public. But I'd say that architecture is a very broad church, and the best practices are engaged across all facets of it.
wicked. Hey, look, before we wrap up, I just want to put a shout out. Like I said in my introduction, when I went to my brother-in-law and he said, "Oh, my nephew's quite good," I'm pleasantly surprised. I just want to thank you for all the thought you put into this. Obviously, yeah, wonderful insight. I think kids at school will be now starting to actually see it, but a lot of kids just wouldn't even pick it as a career. And I just think the way you've pitched it, the way you've explained it is phenomenal. And even kids in their studies now, I think, will get a better perspective of what's going to happen later. So look, yeah, just thank you so much. It's been an awesome interview. Really appreciate it. We've had a few guests where I could just sit and just listen. It's wicked.
I really appreciated it, and the questions were really stimulating, and I think forced me to think about things that I probably haven't verbalized in quite a while. So I really appreciate it for that.
Well, thank you. And the last question we always ask Nick is, if you could go back to yourself, because you've given advice to so many people here, but just Nick to Nick in year 13 or perhaps 12, what advice would you give specifically?
This might be one of those moments where you need to do some editing. It's all needed. I would say, if I was to give a piece of advice, would be not to be hung up by the norms or the expectations of whatever social group or educational institution that you belong to at a certain moment in time, but actively seek out opportunities beyond that, and probably have the bravery earlier to pursue things that you're interested in but aren't fully exploring yet.
Perfect.
Thank you so, so much. Like Ludlam said, super eloquent, detailed answers, but whether you're into architecture or not, someone's going to take something away from this. And that right there, how you finished, was just perfect. So thank you very much for your time today.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, guys.